I'll get started right away. Here we go. So my outline for today's lecture is I'm going to give a brief background, very brief background to the Upper Paleolithic art that I'm going to be referring to, because I know there may be some people who are in other fields who are joining us today. I'm going to explore very briefly as well the myth of the caveman and relate that to who's making the art. And then I'm going to present two case studies. One in detail, which is a project on children in Upper Paleolithic ceramics. And that's a project I'm doing with Becky Farbstein and that we've just completed. So I'm going to go into that one in more detail. And then very briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about some new work that I'm just starting on looking at finger flutings in Cunelda Cave in Australia. And then I'll wrap up the talk. Okay, so to start then with just a very brief background, because all of you here are specialists, but in case there's anyone who is new to this field. So basically, we're looking at a corpus of art dating anywhere from maybe 45,000 or so years ago, depending on what part of the world we're talking about, till around 12,000 years ago. Images in Europe in particular, the furthest east, or Eurasia, the furthest east being in Russia, the furthest west being Creswell Crags in the UK. And we're starting now to fill in some of these gaps in the distribution of art across Europe. As all of you know, this art is known for using the cave's natural topography to give a sense of three-dimensionality to the art. So one of my favorites is from Grotte de Cognac, where you have the natural flow stone giving a sense of that shagginess to the ibex coat. And of course, Altamira in Spain, where you have these bison and you have the roundedness of them being provided by the natural rock protrudences. They're also, cave artists are also well known for using light, and some of that work is coming out of your university, obviously, how people are using light to be able to create the art and to also experience the art. And it's really an important aspect that we sometimes forget about when we're looking at these images in books. They're two-dimensional, they're very flat, and we don't get that sense of what it would be like to look at them by the flickering light of a lamp or a torch or something like that. So the work that people are doing now in bringing that experience back to us is so important for us to understand how people saw the art at the time it was made. And of course, in terms of subject matter or content, we have all kinds of animals, primarily herbivores, but other animals as well. For example, we have here mammoths and ibex and bison and rhinos and so on. And then I also wanted to throw in the weasel because that's my favorite. One of my favorite images is of the weasel there. And then, of course, owls and fish and other sorts of things. And we have them both in parietal art and in portable art. And these lovely examples are some things I'll return to in a minute. And then, of course, we have humans, both in terms of handprints and human figures, again, in parietal art, as well as in the portable art, as in a variety of figurines. And we have fantastical creatures that are some sort of combination of human and animal, or to make an image of a creature that is unknown today. And then of course we have all of the cave signs, and in Spain in particular, in some sites, these signs outnumber the number of other kinds of figurative images, or in fact can be only, some caves would have only these sorts of signs in them. So that, of course, is just like the briefest overview of the kind of the richness and variety of the corpus of art that we're talking about today. And of course, the question is, who's made this art? And so in some ways we can say, well, overwhelmingly, the art is made by anatomically modern humans. And of course, there are some examples now that are possibly, or that seem to be associated with Neanderthals, but overwhelmingly the art that we've been looking at is associated with modern humans. These are people living a nomadic to semi-sedentary existence, depending on where and when we're talking about. In Europe, in small groups of 20 to 30, living in caves sometimes, rock shelters, open air sites, and so on. There are these large game hunters, also specialists of medium game as well, and individuals who had a great knowledge of plants, so they knew their materials. They were able to make the pigments that they're able to, and that are, you know, making up the paintings that we have here and so on. They have extensive trade networks. So we have shells, we have mammoth ivory moving across the continent, and they have well-developed communities of practice, as we'll see, around ceramics, but also around tool production, music, textiles, and personal ornaments. So these, in a general sense, are the people who are making the art, both parietal and portable art, that we saw in the previous slides. But the question that we're more interested in today, of course, is who specifically made the art. What are, you know, who in whose hand is the pigment being held, and so on. And when it comes to anything, at least until recently, when it comes to that question, who did anything in the Paleolithic, who made the tools, who hunted, who, any of those sorts of things, we tend to have one answer, or we until recently thought that question was answered. And Rosemary Joyce in 2008 wrote that, you know, we don't ask the questions that we think have already been answered. And that really influences our research directions. And so when it comes to hunting or tool making, there was, for the longest time in our field, the assumption that men were doing the vast majority of this work, and adult men in particular. And so in some ways, when we talk about man the hunter and man the tool maker, there is this, on one level, it was meaning humankind is unique because they are the big game hunters or the tool makers. And of course, the more we learned about non-human primates and other species actually making tools, then we had to start redefining what made humans unique. We had to say, okay, well, we make tools that make other tools. And then, you know, again, seeing how complex chimpanzee tool use is, we had to keep making more and more refined definitions for ourselves. But in other ways, it wasn't just, you know, it wasn't just man standing in for all of humankind. There was also an assumption that it was men alone doing this kind of work. And so more and more ethnographic studies have been done to try and show, or that have been showing, that women actually have been hunting, or hunt in many traditional societies, that they make stone tools and so on. And that's not to say that men aren't doing this kind of work as well, but that we have to, instead of making assumptions about who's doing what, about what people's roles were in the Paleolithic, that we have to start with the question. We have to not assume that we already know the answer, because when I look at a stone tool, there's nothing about that stone tool that tells me specifically whether or not you know, a man or a woman, or whatever gender people would have identified as, has made that tool. I have to ask questions and look at a variety of sources of information to try and come to a particular answer. And it's the same thing when it comes to the cave art. We've long had this idea that it has been adult men making the art right from the very beginnings of the discovery of this first art all the way till today. If you do a Google search on cave art, the vast majority of the imagery still shows drawings of men doing this work. And so, and I have like this other cartoon here, which was made by, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was by the artist that Francois Borde used to work with, and it says toujours célibataire, like still single. It's this guy this one man who's been caught making figurines, and it's this idea that the figurines were made by men, for men, for pornographic reasons, like a Playboy magazine, but in the Paleolithic. And there's always been this sort of unspoken, perhaps, understanding of who's making the art and why. And I've been thinking about this for a really long time, and since at least 2009, but influenced by people like Mae Conkey and Rosemary Joyce and all of those who brought an archaeology of gender, brought questions about gender to the field of archaeology, and not just, as Mae Conkey says, adding women and stirring, but to this recipe, but rather to ask really interesting questions about what women were doing in the past, and also to question again our assumptions. And so some work that I've done in the past with Melanie Chang from Portland State University, has been to really push us to question those assumptions. And we wrote 2 papers, one about the sexy hand axe hypothesis of Steve Mython and Merrick Cohen, where they assumed that, or they argued that symmetrical hand axes were made by male Homo erectus only to impress females, and so on. And we also looked critically at the use of language around the Hohlefels figurine. And I just have one example here in the journal Nature, where they referred to it as a prehistoric pinup. And I had other screenshots from them showing, calling it, 40,000-year-old sex object. And so I think we did an effective critique of the use of language and assumptions in both these cases to show that we shouldn't, we don't know if people in the past had a concept of pornography and whether they would have seen it this way, and so on. So my interest in who's making the art has been going on since at least 2009, but probably earlier than that. And I think, I and others are really challenging archaeologists to examine the assumptions that we're bringing to our work. And so we do have, and so my interest lately has been more looking at the archaeology of children in particular, and looking at Paleolithic children, because there's really been, even though these children make up probably anywhere from half to 2/3 of the population in traditional societies, they've really been ignored until fairly recently by archaeologists. And so I wrote a book called Growing Up in the Ice Age to really look at everything that we know about children during this time period. And we can talk more about that at the end of the talk. But there is actually a lot of good evidence out there for who's entering these caves, and at least making some of the art or being present for the creation of some of this art. And we have, for example, footprints at the site of Basura in Italy. This is some spectacular work where they've been able to reconstruct and analyze about 180 footprints. And we see what may be a little family grouping, exploring this cave, making art, and so on. And of course, other direct evidence that we have looking at handprints, a very early study done by Snow in 2006, trying to discern male and female handprints, and there's been other works and you know, building on that early work. And of course, Veronique's wonderful work here on children's handprints that is really, you know, revolutionizing what we know about children in these caves and our ability to age and sex them and so on. I won't talk about that more because, you know, that's there are other experts here to answer questions on that. But what I did want to do today, though, was talk about one of the studies that I'm doing with Becky Farbstein on children as possible makers of Upper Paleolithic ceramics. And so this is Becky Farbstein, who I've been working with. And she's an expert in Gravettian ceramics, and I've always wanted to work with her, and I thought this would be a wonderful way for us to combine our interests, mine in children and hers in ceramics. And she's done extensive work on the chaîne opératoires of how ceramics and ivory have been made during the Gravettian, in particular these sites, Pavlov and Dolní Vesenice in Czechia, or sorry, which used to be the Czech Republic, but they've changed the name. And so this was a wonderful opportunity for us to work together. As all of you probably know, the earliest ceramics date to roughly 25,000 years ago, and they weren't used, interestingly, they weren't used to make vessels of any kinds, to make pots or anything, but they were actually made to use, they were made, sorry, the ceramics or the pottery was made to make figurines. And I always find that so interesting because the one pottery class that I took to kind of get a better understanding of the materials, the first thing that you do is you make a pinch pot. It's just sort of a natural feeling. You just want to make a little pot out of these things, and you could see how useful they would be. But we've never found anything like that. We find all kinds of little, mostly animal figurines, and then some little humans as well. And so the question that we had is, could some of these figurines, particularly the small animal ones, have been made by or for children? And in a paper from 2018 that I co-authored with Felix Reed and others, we argued that maybe these figurines, you know, this example of portable art might have been one way of, you know, helping children through play learn about their environment, learn about animal behavior, and so on. So maybe these toys could have, you know, maybe they were toys, maybe they could have been used by children as a way of learning through play. And I think clay, you know, is such an obvious medium to look for kids in because it's so easy to work. And we know that from looking ethnographically, especially through the work of Kathy Camp, for example, whose work, she's done ethnographic work as well as archaeological work on ceramics. She makes the point that it's such an easy entry point into a community of practice. So with clay, you can experiment with it. If you make a mistake, you can just squish it up and start again. You know, so it's a really sort of obvious medium for looking for kids. So what we did then, following Kathy Camp, is that she has a number of different variables that she lists as being associated with novices. So that was our first question. Can we see novices in you know, as makers of ceramics in the Gravettian? And so Kathy Camp's variables include, generally novices make smaller sized artifacts. Their pieces tend to be asymmetrical. They tend to have less complex production sequences, so, or chaîne opératoire, as we would say. They also often exhibit what we call non-productivity. So these artifacts are often left where they've been produced. And finally, what we see is a high degree of experimentation. A high degree of experimentation, and we don't see as much seriation in as we do with, say, more experienced makers. So we'll take a look. So what we wanted to do was to take these variables then, and then to apply them to what we know about ceramics and the Gravettian, and see if they correspond to these characteristics of novices. So first of all, we looked at size. We compared the ceramics to other materials used to make art. In particular, we looked at the size of pieces, both figurative and non-figurative or non-diagnostic pieces made out of ivory, bone, and antler. And what we found in what you can see in this chart here is that the ceramics are significantly smaller, that the anthropomorphic and zoomorphic figurines in ceramics are about half the size of similar artifacts made out of ivory. And the same thing when you look at ceramic non-figurative or non-diagnostic pieces, they're about half the size of similar ones in ivory, and even smaller than the ones made in bone or antler. So statistically then, the ceramics are, the figures made out of ceramics are significantly smaller than materials, other materials used to make art at these sites. The only exception seems to be the really finely made, what we might call masterpieces, or the sort of more unusual pieces from this site. So, for example, we have the Dolne Vesinici figurine, or sometimes called Venus, but I hate using that term. But the figurine, which is noticeably bigger than and very finely made. And then we have that, and the same thing with that so-called owl on the right side. So those pieces are quite finely made. They're larger. They're sort of quite unusual, and so there may be a relationship between the biggest figures and more skill in ceramics, and the smaller ones and a little less skill and a little more experimentation in these ceramics. Okay, then we looked at symmetry, and we wanted to know, is there a higher degree of asymmetry in ceramics than when individuals are working with ivory, bone, or antler? And the answer is yes. So what you're looking at here is one of an assemblage of animal heads that were found at the sites of Pavlov 1 and Dolne Vesinici 1. And some of them demonstrate that the craftsperson or the maker created the face in one way on one side, and then used a completely different technique to make the other side to create a completely different result. And so when you look at this little lion's head, for example, on one side, you see just a slit for an eye. They've really made just a very simple engraving, on the surface to make that eye. But on the other side, the eye is fully perforated. It goes all the way through the head. And if you look at the ears are also completely different as well. So it shows that there's a lot of experimentation going on, even in this single lion's head. And it shows that the symmetry of form, so to have both sides being identical, really wasn't a priority for people for this object, or we would argue for this material. So then we looked at experimentation and seriation, and so the significance of this, what we saw when we looked at asymmetry, becomes even more apparent when we compare ceramics to ivory art at the same sites. And so what we see is that both figurative and non-figurative ivory art from sites like Pavlov 1, for example, they're incredibly regular, and they have a high degree of seriation. So in other words, they're making very similar objects. They're making a series of objects. And so, and there's very little, excuse me, there's a very low degree of experimentation here. So for example, what you see on the left are a large, it's an example of a large number of artifacts that are described often as diadems. Those are like headbands or bracelets, and they pretty much all look like this. Like they're very, very similar in form, in decoration, in finish, and so on. And excuse me, even when we look at the figurative art, we look at the lion at the top. We look at the mammoth at the top and the lion at the bottom. There's a strong tendency for this very silhouetted form. This is a very typical way of creating these animals. It's very stylistically and technologically consistent across the site. And that really contrasts with what we see with ceramic figures. So with ceramic figures, there's much more heterogeneity. There's much more variation. So they're more diverse in both in terms of the technique that's being used and the subject matter, and also in sort of the finished form or the finished aesthetics, like how it looks at the end. So for example, you can see these two animals here. One of them, the forelimbs are made, separately. The one on the bottom, you can see the forelimbs are made as two separate pieces. But at the top, it's a much more generalized form, and you can see that the forelimbs have been created to be as part of one piece. There's I should also just come back here. Sorry, there's also variation in the kinds of surface decorations that we're seeing, the kinds of engravings and ornamentation. And so even though we see clear preferences or clear tendencies for the final object, the final finished product, when we're looking at art made out of other materials, this doesn't seem to be the case when we look at at pieces made out of ceramics. Okay. So looking at technique then, looking at the kinds of, chaîne opératoire, do we see any difference here? And again, we think the answer is yes. So objects made out of ivory and bone and antler are really what we would say temporally elaborated. So in other words, it took a long time to make these objects, to collect and to process, collect the raw materials and process them, and to make the different figures out of these materials. And they also involved a lot of different kinds of tools. But when we look at the process for ceramics, we look at the chaîne opératoire for ceramics, what we see is that they're using, the sediment. So sediment that's part of the site itself is being collected. So it's being collected locally and very expediently. And you could probably do this just one person, a single individual in the course of their everyday life could stop and collect some sediment on the site that is then later used to produce ceramics. And, this is something that could easily have been done by a child who's starting to learn the properties of the ceramic material, how to work it and so on. One of the first things they would probably do is be in charge of collecting that sediment. You don't need any special tools to be, to make it, to collect this material. You don't need any particular skills. So no real skillfulness is required to collect and process this raw material. But if we contrast that with what people need to do in order to make figures out of ivory, it's so much more elaborate. So at the very least, you need to get that ivory somehow. So you have to either hunt a mammoth, or you have to be able to scavenge a tusk. So you physically need to leave the site itself. You need cooperation among a group of people. And again, you need, in this case, you need skillfulness, you need skills to be able to hunt that mammoth or even to scavenge the tusk. Scavenging requires a lot more skill than we sometimes think. And then there's also all kinds of specialized tools involved in scraping and breaking apart, splintering, sculpting, and engraving the tusk itself. And this is really different from ceramics, where, as I said, it's much more expedient, no specialized tools, and so on. So there's a real contrast in the chaîne opératoire between ceramics and other kinds of materials used to make art, and ivory in particular. And then finally, we considered the idea of non-productivity. So where are we finding these objects, in other words? And we see some really interesting patterns here. So the Pavlovian sites that we've been talking about are obviously famous for ceramics, but they're also famous for having a large number of burials. And in some of these burials, we see highly diverse assemblages of ornamental culture that have been buried with individuals, that have been interred with humans, with the bodies. And so, for example, at the site of Brno 2, which is really close to Pavlov, there is this three-part ivory figurine that you see in the center. It's often referred to as the marionette figure because it's not broken. It's three separate pieces of ivory that can be fitted together. So some people describe it as a marionette or a puppet, but we don't know if that's how it functioned. But it's a really unusual piece. And it's found in a burial alongside discs, as you can see on the left, made out of, excuse me, mammoth molars and all different kinds of soft stones, so different colors. In other burials, we also see perforated teeth, perforated shells, alongside a whole diverse assemblage of material culture. But in all of the burials, to our knowledge, to my knowledge and Becky's knowledge, there is not one single example of ceramics being included in the burial. And we can actually make the claim that ceramics were being intentionally excluded from the burials. So if we find other material culture in the burials and we don't find ceramics in the burials, where are we finding ceramics? Excuse me. And so what we know is we find the ceramics in or immediately next to the hearth structures. So what you see on the left is a drawing of one of these hearths as they might have existed at these sites. And on the right, you see a drawing of one of the first excavations at Dolní Věstonice. And the gray area that you see on that on that map is an ashy lens. It's a hearth feature. And inside it, and immediately around the periphery of that sort of ashy lens, is where we find a good number of the ceramic figurines. And so what some archaeologists working in this area have suggested that maybe the figurines are being used, maybe the figurines are being ritually exploded, part of what has been termed pyrotechnical performance. So in other words, they're intentionally exploding them as they place them in the hearth to fire the ceramics. I think that's a hypothesis that can be debated, whether this is intentional or unintentional, the explosion of these in the fire. But I think what we can say, putting that hypothesis aside for a moment, or what we can say is that whether or not you accept the hypothesis the ceramics, what we can say is that the ceramics are not moving very far from where they're made. You know, they're being made adjacent to the fire, and then they're being placed in the fire as part of that short production sequence, and they never leave. Like, they're being made there, they're fired there, they're left there, like that's it. And so it's a very different life history than what we see with other symbolic culture at these sites. It's much shorter, and again, there's that element of non-productivity with the ceramic figurines. They don't seem to be being made for a specific purpose in the same way that we see with materials, with art made out of other materials, and that really distinguishes them from how people are using those other raw materials. So if we go back to those research questions, what can we say? Well, our first question was, can art produced by novices be distinguished from those made by experts in the Paleolithic? And we think yes. There is a lot of good evidence, some of which I've shown today, that allow us to be able to distinguish between two different kinds of craftspeople in the Paleolithic or in the Gravettian, and the sorts of artifacts or art that they're making. So in this instance, at the site, ceramics seem to be the type of material culture that is more, that is made by novices. And so then, building on that, our follow-up question is, is there evidence that some novices were children? And in this question, or the answer to this question, we also think is yes. And we're actually quite lucky that some of the ceramics preserve fingerprints of the people who made them. And some of our Czech colleagues have previously analyzed these fingerprints and published evidence showing that some of the fingerprints on the ceramics belong to subadults, belong to children and adolescents. So, for example, the fingerprint on the back of the Donli Vesinici figurine, it belongs to someone of around the age 7 to 13. So it's not just evidence of novices as distinguished from experts as makers of some of these crafts in the Upper Paleolithic, but that some of these novices were indeed children. And I think the other aspect to remember about all of this, of course, is coming back to that idea that clay is easy to work, that it's a forgiving material. It doesn't require a lot of skill to enter into this community of practice, that you can start on the periphery by collecting the raw materials, by maybe getting the firewood to make the fire for the hearth and so on, and that you can learn through play, and that the kinds of objects, these animal figurines and so on, are perfect for kids to be able to learn more about their environment, learn about animal behavior and so on in a fun way. And that's something that we definitely see ethnographically. And so then, very briefly, in the last few minutes that I have with you, I'm just going to talk about some new work that I'm starting with some colleagues in Australia. So I'm starting to work, well, I have been working for a few years now at the site of Cunalda in Australia on rock art there, but we're starting a new phase of research. And this is work that I'm doing with some colleagues, Karen Walsh from the University of Auckland, and Andrea Giattoloni, who's at Griffith University in the Gold Coast. And we also work with Aboriginal colleagues, Anton Mundi, who you see there, and also Clem Lowry, who is not in this photo, but is in my next photo. And so we're having so in this sort of collaborative project that we're doing, we're looking to the community to help drive some of our research questions. And so we've taken sort of three approaches to this new phase of our work there, because research has been going on since, for decades. I've only been working there a few years, but this is, as I say, a new phase in our research. And so what we're interested in doing is looking at finger flutings that I'll show some images of in a second, and at how they have been studied in the past, particularly within a European context, so kind of probing that a little bit more, and then initiating a new way to study finger flutings, and to try and interpret them within a very specifically Australian context. So this is work that it's at the very beginnings, it's in its infancy, so I don't really have a lot of results for you, but I'm going to more tell you what we're doing, and to stay tuned for results in the very near future. So Cunalda Cave, and we see Anton in the photograph on the right, Anton standing at the edge of the entrance, or where you climb down into Cunalda Cave, and we see Clem on just near him, the center figure. So Cunalda Cave is a deep cave within the boundary of the Nullarbor National Park, and it's approximately 1,200 kilometers west of Adelaide in South Australia. And so often when we think about Australia and the kinds of landscapes there and so on, I mean, this is the iconic Australian landscape. It's an absolutely beautiful place to be working, and I feel very privileged to be able to be part of this project and to, again, work with our Aboriginal colleagues, our traditional owner colleagues. So Cunalda Cave, we know, has been visited continuously by Indigenous people to mark the walls, to extract flint, and so on for more than 30,000 years. And that is, even through the last glacial maximum and so on, there has been cultural continuity that is maintained to this day. So the colleagues that we work with speak of visiting this site as children, remembering their previous generations going to this site and so on. And Cunalda is exciting because it has the largest and most intact display of finger flutings in the world. And this is just a little image to show you us, you have to sort of belay down. You climb down using a ladder, but with belaying equipment, climbing equipment on you, and to get into that cave. And it's quite a climb. For people like Karen, who is like a mountain goat, she's like an ibex. She is up and down the cave, no problem. I have a huge fear of heights, so this is a tremendous challenge, and it's only because the art is so amazing that I return. So when you climb down into the cave and you get to that main area where some of the excavations have taken place, and I thought, okay, great, we're at the art. And then Karen pointed out to me that we have to climb back up the ramparts and over some rockfall to get to the art. But what you're seeing on the right-hand side are some of the finger flutings in what we call the art chamber. And so the finger flutings, finger flutings, as you may or may not know, probably most of you do, are channels that are drawn in soft sediment, sort of that moon milk. It's like a precipitate that develops naturally in limestone caves, and it often covers walls, floors, ceilings, and so on of limestone caves in Australia and in Europe, for example, as well. And I always say to my students, think about it. If you've come out of a shower and you've steamed up the bathroom mirror and you run your fingers down it, the kind of streaking there is similar, except that there's a three-dimensional quality to this. So it's moist enough to be able to shape with your fingers the sediment, but firm enough that it holds its shape after you've done that. And we now know that finger flutings date back to about 50,000 years ago, which has been super exciting with recent research showing that Neanderthals did this, at least in one cave in France. So very exciting to see that this is something that's made by more than one type of human. So when the finger flutings in Cunalda were first recorded by archaeologists back in the 1950s, the focus of research was really on why they were being made, what were they trying to communicate, and so on. But around 50 years later, as part of a growing interest in the individual in the past, researchers began to ask questions about who made them. And so today, it's argued that by measuring the widths of the middle three fingers in particular of flutings of either hand, archaeologists can infer age, for example, and if you're looking, and also, age and sex, and also individuality, that we can identify different specific individuals and their contributions to finger fluting. So, looking at who made these engravings. And the claims rest on a single database that was created in 2006 by my friend and colleague, Leslie Van Gelder, and her late husband, Kevin Sharp, who were really pioneers in many ways in being able to kind of decipher these flutings that seem almost, undecipherable or indecipherable, or like impenetrable. So they were really pioneers in trying to sort this out, and they were also pioneers in trying to look for individuals and in particular looking for children. So a real contribution to the field in that way, in many ways. And so, but when Karen and I started to look more deeply into some of the data that was into this database that has been traditionally used for studying finger flutings in Cunalda as well as in Europe, we started to wonder if it was adequate for the kinds of approaches that we wanted to take to looking at the flutings in Cunalda now. So the database is based on 135 participants whose ages range from 2 to 55, and there's an uneven distribution of participants by age and sex, so it varies quite a bit. So the older half, so from 16 to 55, for example, we have only 14 individuals represented, 4 females and 10 males. The largest category is of the sample is made up by kids 5 to 6, and that's about 20% of the sample. But using this database and various experiments that went along to creating the database, Sharp and Van Gelder were able, to set a threshold of 33 millimeters to separate a child from a non-child, and they said around 7 years old. They also looked at sex based on Peters and colleagues' research on the 2D/4D ratio, and again, something all of you are familiar with, where you compare the second and fourth digits of the hand. Females are supposed to have roughly, 1-to-1 ratio, whereas males, the second digit is supposed to be significantly shorter. And then they were also saying, because they were finding similar numbers coming up when they measured the number of millimeters of those middle finger, three middle fingers, that they were able to identify different hands, different individuals' contributions. And so when we looked more broadly, though, at these experiments and we looked at the sources of variation, we realized that there are some issues in terms of sources of variation, that the kind of finger flutings or the measurement, the width of the finger fluting represented by or created by those fingers can really change based on, for example, how much pressure is applied, what kind of medium. So not, we talk about wound milk or precipitate, but it really varies from cave to cave, because of the level of moisture and other sorts of things, and that can have a real impact on the measurements as well. Also, the angle of wrist, which is particularly important for if you're trying to get that 2D/4D ratio. The positioning of the calipers, where you're close to the flutings but not touching them. So how you're positioning it can also add or subtract a millimeter. where you decide to measure on the fluting stream, and kind of the comparability between the experimental environment where you're doing something on a flat, on a flat surface versus the cave environment. We also looked at Peters et al.'s work on 2D/4D ratio, and they're quite clear that a dichotomy in data related to sex doesn't actually exist because there's too much overlap between male and female ratios. So we felt, after looking at all of this, that while this has been a huge contribution to the field, that it's not possible using these sort of traditional techniques to achieve the precision required to be able to accurately or reliably infer age, sex, and individuality from the flutings. And so what we are doing, building on this research, in a sense, is that we've now started a program that Andrea is in charge of in particular, where we're using photogrammetry to basically scan all of these finger flutings, and we're doing a lot of experimental work now to be able to train a computer to be able to identify these different gestures. And so so we have, if any of you are going to be at the Australian Archaeological Association meetings in a couple of weeks, we'll have a booth there where we're actually asking people to do finger flutings for us, both in a tactile, using a medium as close as we can to get to the moon milk there, that sediment, but also using virtual reality headsets and using that to be able to train a computer to be able, as I say, to look at these different gestures, not necessarily individual hands, because within an Australian context, the individual tends to be less important and it's more the community. And so what we're looking at, so we're not trying to get at sex or age at this particular time anyways, but we are trying to look at looking at how these finger flutings are being created and whether we can identify different gestures and then try to interpret that within an Australian Aboriginal context that makes sense to people who create works of art often as communities. So in conclusion, then, thank you so much for your attention today. The man, the hunter, and tool maker hypothesis has, had for such a long time impeded our understanding of the roles of Paleolithic people more broadly. And this includes looking at who is making the art. So looking at the roles of women and children in the Paleolithic has really been part of a larger sea change, where we're interested in looking at diverse peoples, diverse voices, and so on in the past. And so with some of the research I've been doing recently, we, I think, have strong evidence for children as novices making ceramics. And with new work that I'm doing, we're looking at new technologies and new approaches, such as those being applied at Cunalda, to open up new ways, new avenues for exploring the roles of adults and children, of men and women, and any other sort of gender that people may have self-identified as in the past. So thank you very much. And I would just like to acknowledge all my co-authors and co-researchers here, and the people who are funding us and provided us access to these assemblages. I'm super grateful to all of them. And if you are at the AAA's, come and see us. We'll be giving 3 papers on our work at Cunalda, in 10 days. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. It was a really pleasure. And now we can start the question round. So if anybody have any question or reflection or contribution, we can discuss now. You can write on the chat and we will say them in loud. I wanted to know, to be the first, what kind of methodology you are training the computer to examine the finger flutings?
Yeah, so this, I have to say, is totally not my area. It's more, I'm helping to collect the experimental data, but it's more my colleague, Andrea Gialloni, who is doing the actual training. So she's using QGIS and so on to be able to do that. But I have to admit, I don't have the background to be able to answer that very specifically, but she'll be presenting a paper on that, and I can ask her to be able to share that with you if you would like. Yeah, she and her graduate students are more familiar with that aspect of the project.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question in the chat. The first one is if you could tell him or her if what kind of material they use in the process of making art, and the second one, if you've ever found any human fossil evidence where you find the Upper Paleolithic art or figurines. So if no, that relation exists.
Oh, wait, so I'm sorry. So I'll answer the first question. So I'm sorry, what was the first question exactly?
Can you tell me what is the raw material that people use to make the Upper Paleolithic art? I mean,
okay.
Probably in Australian context.
Okay. Oh, in an Australian context. So art. So basically, it's the similar kinds of things when you're talking about rock art. People are using, natural minerals like ochres and so on, and that's part of the problem in terms of being able to date some of them. We have the same sorts of challenges that if you don't have organic materials. It makes it more difficult to date. So same kinds of things as in Europe, natural minerals, and then with the finger flutings, that's really just people's fingers being drawn through what we call moon milk, or it's a chemical process. Basically, it's a precipitate that lines the limestone caves, and it feels kind of like. Sort of like wet sand, but not exactly. And so that's what people are drawing. They're using to trace their fingers through. Yeah. So I don't know if that answers the question. If you're talking more broadly about pigments being used in Europe, then you've got, again, same sorts of things, different kinds of ochres, charcoal, manganese, calcium, what's the word I'm looking for, like for clay and things like that to make the white and so on. So there's all kinds of natural minerals that people are using. There are some interesting studies that people are doing on figurines, though, coming out of the site of Malta and Siberia, where they've found traces of blue and green on the figurines, so cobalt and so on. And that's something really interesting because we always think about those blues and greens as being very difficult colors to make, and that they have a more recent origin. And we're used to looking at cave art, which is the browns and the reds and the oranges and so on. But there is some evidence now to suggest that people were able to make more complex dyes really early. It may be, and we're seeing these traces on the figurines out of Malta. It may be they don't preserve as well, so that's why we don't see them anywhere else, or it may be just a very local invention, which is also really interesting in and of itself. And then the second question was, do we ever find bodies?
Human fossil evidence where you find art and figurines?
Art and figurines. Yeah, so so there are some, so generally, again, it depends where we're talking about, but generally in the caves that we're looking at in France and Spain and so on, many of those caves are not places where people are living. These seem to be places where people are visiting to make the art, or to have, I always think that people are there. I'm always interested in the relationship between storytelling and the arts. So I think that people may have gone into these caves to in Europe to look at sort of visual components of storytelling and so on. So they're using these caves in many different ways. It doesn't seem to be that these are places where people are living. There are some caves, though, where we do find skeletal remains, but that's really really, what's the word I'm looking for, the more rare exception. So it would be nice to be able to make a strong connection between certain kinds of people and certain kinds of art, but we don't seem to have that. It's a more rare association.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any other question? Please put in the chat. There's a comment. Yeah, it says, thank you so much. It was very insightful, and examination of fingerprints would be very helpful to recognize if they were mostly made by children or adult. One recent publication on a figurine from the Neolithic site of Tel Halula, Syria, shows that it was made by an adult.
Ah, okay. I don't know that site. That would be really interesting to take a look at. And I think, again, I think one of the strengths of the study that Becky and I are doing is that we're looking at material from the same sites. So we're looking at how people at these Pavlovian sites, so, all the ones in the region, Pavlov, Donetsk, and so on, how they're making both the ceramics at these sites and the ivory, bone, and antler artifacts as well. And so to be able to do sort of an internal comparison, like we imagine that this is the same societies, these are the same culture groups making both. And so so when we see such differences there, we think they are related to sort of internal cultural preferences and choices. But it doesn't mean that necessarily ceramics everywhere are being made, everywhere and every time are being made, just by novices or just by children as novices. So I think that's why it's sort of fun to see that the chaîne opératoire is so different within the same sites. And also it could be that there are older people making some of the ceramics and older novices and so on. People can learn a technique at any age. But the fact that at least some of them are being made by kids, I think is quite evident.
And also, it's kind of impossible to differentiate if they were made by adults or infants and after used by another person, because maybe you don't have like the creation marks; they are only manipulation marks.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, so that's the thing, we can say a certain amount. We can say, okay, there's a lot of evidence for people who made them being novices. In some cases, it looks like these novices are children. But what happens to those pieces afterwards is a really good question. Anyone can use them. If they're fire hardened, you're not going to have, not going to be able to really pick up after all this time the fingerprints, or at least, especially after people have handled them in labs and so on. So it is always, we always have to remember that we are limited to some degree by what we can and can't say in the deep past. But by bringing these new technologies and asking new questions, we sometimes find new answers, things that we didn't think we'd be able to look at. And so Becky, for example, has studied these ceramics for years. I mean, she's really the one who came up with the different chaîne opératoires for the different materials and so on. But she had never thought to ask whether they could be associated with children, or whether they could be associated with novices. And so she has this gigantic database of images, and we went back to that with a brand new question and with new eyes, and saw something that she hadn't seen when she'd been doing all her research originally. It was only when thinking back, she was like, I think we have an example of that. Let me find that. So it's really been quite fun in that way to work together on this project. So.
I think that's everything. Yeah, we don't have any more questions in the chat.
Okay, so thank you very much. Well, there is another question.
Okay.
Veronica.
Yeah. What kind of dating method or approach is used to find out the period of the finger flooding?
Yeah, so in some cases you have calcite that covers it, and so you can date the calcite. In other cases, you have to do it indirectly. We have well, we have some dates coming out that I can't really share. So there's another way of doing this that I just realized I can't necessarily say anything right now. But there are a variety of methods. One of them is directly dating that calcite. It forms over the finger flutings, and below that's younger. The finger flutings are older, so it's at least that old. But in some cases, if you don't have the calcite and you don't have any other kinds of materials to be able to date, then you have to infer it based on maybe indirectly from the kinds of stone tools that are associated or something like that. So yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much, April. It was really pleasure to have you with us. I think that we have to finish. So I want just to remind you that next December 20, we will have the next speaker with us. It will be Olivia Rivero. She will speak also about learning processes in Paleolithic art. That one will be in Spanish. But well, we invite you, every one of you, to be with us once again. So thank you very much again, April, and bye-bye to all of you. See you.
Thank you very much. Take care. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye.
You too.